Mm-hmm.
And then we make it a little bit more formal because we need to explain for those people who watch us later what we are actually doing here, and so that people even who have not been here can still understand what this whole session is all about. So my name is Anja König. I lead Transformative Finance at EVPA. I'm here with one of my colleagues of the Transformative Finance Lab team, Aline from Endeavor, as well as Erik Øverland, the guest of today's sessions. Before we dive into the wonderful world of future thinking, I would just like to say a few more words about transformative finance at EVPA and why we're offering the Transformative Finance Initiative, or why we're covering this topic at EVPA. So I think we are all quite clear that the pandemic, the climate crisis, and the emerging energy and food crisis from the war in Ukraine all have something in common. There are complex and unpredictable challenges that no one actor can resolve alone, and that require probably a different kind of intervention and financing logic compared to how we've been dealing with these problems in the past. This is actually true. It's not only for the pandemic or the climate crisis or the emerging food crisis. It's true actually for most societal challenges that we're seeking to tackle, be it education, health, or other topics. But I feel that despite the increasing awareness that we have, that these challenges are complex and we need to do something differently, still the financing support solutions are all developed in a sort of isolated way. We're disconnected from each other, and we continue in finance, at least we continue with our project by project, deal by deal logic. So at EVPA, we have come to realize that in impact finance, really, we need new methods, new investment strategies and leadership skills also to be able to address these challenges in a different way. And there are certain practices where we're looking at where we realize, our linear way of intervention maybe has to be replaced somehow by a more emergent, a circular approach. And it actually, if you look at the entire spectrum of our interventions and our investment logic, you'll see that these methods actually make sense in a number of other areas. We need to move away from these isolated interventions towards more collaborative and co-creative approaches. We found then, when we looked at what alternative options there are, we found that actually in finance there is a lack of physical but also mental spaces that allow us to rethink finance and also to bring organizations across the spectrum of capital together. At EVPA, we really want to help these investing for impact interventions more transformative. So this is why last year we launched the Collab Award, an award to give visibility to system practices. And this year we started with the design of a Transformative Finance Lab. Later this year, we hope to launch our first CFL Transformative Finance Lab prototype, probably on education, but let's see what will happen. And next year, maybe on other thematic challenges. So we don't really know what this the Finance Lab is all about. We only know that it will be a facilitated space that will allow for co-creating financing solutions to systemic challenges. We know that we like to engage a diverse range of different actors. And we know that we like to use some explorative methods of co-creating and facilitating this space. We also have come to realize, interestingly, over the last couple of weeks, that maybe beyond producing a specific financing product at the end of the day, it is also the purpose of such a lab is also to help and establish new and existing and deepen existing connections between people, between peers maybe, but also unlikely allies across the spectrum in different sectors, and maybe also to inspire new perspective and possibilities. So what we have done in the last couple of weeks, we as part of this process that we are conducting in partnership with Jacobs Foundation, we last week we had an Impact for Breakfast session, and you can still see the links, the video of that session. We also hosted a design workshop on early May. I don't know whether my colleague, I think my colleague Peter is now here. Maybe Peter, you can share the links in the chat. And also we've been conducting these informal public interviews for the last couple of weeks, which was a very enjoyable, very interesting experience that we had. We did this for our own benefits to really understand and benefit from the knowledge of lab designers, of thought leaders in the space of innovation, about better understanding about their methodologies and see what we can use for the lab methodology. But also we thought it would be useful to be able to share that knowledge also with the wider impact finance community. And we will upload the recordings and the transcript on our website. Maybe Peter, you can also share the link to the website. So I mentioned earlier that the lab may also be intentionally designed in a way to inspire and open up new possibilities. And this is why we actually started to explore about future thinking methodologies. And future thinking as a creative process, method, and mindset of identifying alternative futures and using these insights from these foresights to take action and shape the kind of future we want to see in place. In that way, we hope this can be another methodology for embracing that kind of complexity that I described in the beginning. But I'm sure Erik has a lot of things to say about these topics. And this time we actually invited Erik Øverland. He's the president of the World Future Studies Federation, expert on research and innovation policy issues with the Ministry of Education and Research in Norway, and co-chief editor of the European Journal of Futures Research in Germany. So thank you very much, Erik, for being with us and providing us with this kind of introduction. We thought we can have this session with a 20 minutes or so input by yourself, and then we can ask some more questions, and also maybe our participants would also like to join the conversation, ask some question. So if you have a concrete question coming up already while you listen to Erik, don't be shy and put them in the chat, and we can get back to that later on. So over to you, Erik. I'm really looking forward to the next 50 minutes or so.
Thank you, Anja. Thank you. Good to see you again. Anja and I had a nice meeting in Berlin recently, and there we found out that it could be a good idea that I pass by and talk a bit about what I'm dealing with. Before I start, I just want to say that as a president of the World Future Studies Federation, we represent a kind of network internationally about futurists and future foresight practitioners, and also a lot of scholars who want to are very involved in creating new ways of approaching the future, so to say. So that's the point of departure that I'm going to take now. And additionally, you mentioned my ministerial work, because that's where I earn my money. So the recent development in that sense is that I'm going to, from August, I'm going to be placed at Norwegian embassy in Berlin to represent Norway on educational and research policy issues. So I'm looking very forward to that. So my relation to Germany, between other things, are very, somehow a long relationship. Just to say that. Okay, I'm going to
you in Berlin.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I'm just going to share some my presentation. Okay. Future thinking. I skipped the Europeans one. What I'm going to talk about today is about how do we relate to trends and uncertainty, and what the author Nassim uh, Taleb is talking about when he's talking about the black swans. I think that could be a good point of departure to explain the shift in thinking when we are moving into future studies and future research. And then something more about the more educational and also about the methodological approaches that the field of foresight and future studies represent. And then I'm going to take an example from the educational sector, which could be transferred to the financial sector. So it could be some some learnings to there's some lessons to be learned there. Uh, I don't know if you know Nassim Taleb. He's most probably you know him because he's a very famous guy, and he wrote the book Black Swan. Has also written a couple of other books. The reason why I refer to him is that he's actually written several books in with 700-800 pages without mentioning the tradition that I belong to with one single word. And I think that's also very interesting because he's coming from a more scientific, um, statistical area, and he's also, I think, a political scientist using quantitative data analysis, modeling, and he is very critical to that tradition now, and also uh, in a way that correspond very much to the people who are doing foresight and future studies. So that's the reason why I very often refer to Nassim Taleb, because he's, pointing and moving us in a different direction without referring to the whole tradition that I belong to. But it's a kind of, to me, it's a kind of a confirmation of that foresight tradition. What is the uh, main idea behind his work? That is, the world is marked by extreme events. We experience more surprises. Some events represent a tremendous significance, which is exactly what Anya pinpointed at in her introduction. And now, I mean, we are living in an incredible time at the time being with the Ukraine crisis. We have had a pandemic, and we have a lot of other possible crisis around the corner, which is a big and huge crisis, which many of us, I don't say all of us, but a lot of people didn't expect to come for just a few years back. And that is exactly what he's trying to do, and also what the foresighters are trying to do, is to try to think, on possible change and possible developments that are surprising us in one way or another. So I won't elaborate very much on the detail of what he's doing, but exactly to try to go beyond forecasting. I don't know if you know the term forecasting, but that's if you rely on historical events and historical developments and a quantitative analysis of historical events, and then you try to forecast, and you're saying what would happen if these kind of developments continue in the future. What kind of consequences would that give for my organization, me as a person, or my country, or whatever. And this shift from the forecasts and prediction logic toward the more non-linear elaboration of possible outcomes, the more focus at uncertainties and so on and so forth, that represent a kind of a shift. And this shift is more elaborating. elaborated than we think of, because I mean, I'm working with political administrative system, ministries, and so on and so forth. And in particular, you shouldn't believe that, but in particular in Norway, for example, the way of thinking through forecast and social economic modeling has had a hegemony over many years, and also the policy documents are very influenced by these kind of conventional forecast exercises. So it's still a long way to go to change that in the system. But you see, Germany, for example, you have started a department within the Kanzleramt, the Prime Minister office, to try to elaborate on long-term consequences due to the analysis of uncertainties and possible surprises in the consequences of what's possible political decisions and so on and so on. So I think there's a really a kind of a tremendous shift in thinking also on the politically administrative level. You see it in Finland, you see it in Singapore, you see it in a lot of other countries now, that you can't think along the same term. The future is not a linear development exercise. You have to think differently in quite a substantial way. And what I'm going to talk about is, what is that difference? What does it mean to think differently? So predictions is impossible. Is that true or untrue? Forecasts are kind of a tyranny of the past. The most central challenge of our time is how to prepare for the unexpected, the unknowns, as Nassim Taleb said. So it's kind of an exercise to try to do something impossible, but to do this thing that looks like being impossible, you actually are creating some expectations, some ideas that can help you to manage the situation when something surprisingly happens. And that means, for example, in advance of the so prior to the pandemic, a lot of colleagues of mine in the network, because we have many members in Australia, in Asia, so they have some more experience with pandemic than we had in Europe, for example, and they created scenarios about pandemic development, which were quite close to the actual development of COVID-19 pandemic. But in Europe and in the States, you haven't had any similar exercises like that. So you were much more surprised than other people were, and I think that's also an interesting lesson learned from the recent pandemic. So the really main argument behind the Black Swan study of Nassim Taleb is that the pace of time appears to be faster and faster. Things do not happen in the way we expect. What do we do then? The unthinkable happens. You see, well, some might say that Putin's war wasn't unthinkable, but for many of us, it was actually unthinkable that he really did what he did. For a thinking presupposes a conscious relationship to uncertainties. The unlikely is becoming more significant, and just taste on the word likely, unlikely. I'm gonna say something more about that term later, but if you see, if when you are discussing going into discussion about the possible future or futures, a lot of people immediately say, no, what you're saying there is unlikely, so why should we discuss that? It's so unlikely, we shouldn't discuss it at all. And that's very typical. But the foresight methodology said, well, if that's unlikely ideas are in a ways in such format that if it against expectation should happen, then it would have a lot of tremendous consequences. So we should discuss it. So we shouldn't leave it out. I think that's also a very important shift in the thinking, that you have to be prepared to discuss things that you in the beginning of the process think is unlikely. And we need long-term future thinking and uncertainty management. The are increasing, as I said, and forecasts and prognosis are not able to grasp trends in coming, early signals, long-term change of technology. So you can shift complexity in an appropriate way. So we really have to change this idea. So in a world marked by a high level of uncertainties, increased degree of ambitions to interpret the ongoing social and economic change, more complexity, but still the expectation by people to create a kind of a robust and foreseeable development of society, there's a rapid growing need for new planning tools, robust policy development and change management. That's exactly what I interpret that you are trying to do with the Transformative Finance Lab. These are only some anecdotic examples of what could happen if you don't do that. I mean, even Bill Gates, and that was in the 70s, he said that we will never make a 33-bit operating system, for example, because he was, even he was, kind of have a tunnel perspective in what he was doing. Historically, Lord Kelvin said at the end of the 18th century, heavier than air flying machine are impossible. I mean, that could be a reasonable idea, but at that time, due to the gravity and so on and so forth, but it was wrong. And another one, the Americans have a need of a telephone, but we do not. We have plenty of messenger boy. That's just some fun facts around the historical way of doing, thinking narrowly in the wrong way. And personally, I also met Heinz Nixdorf at that time was very good, very comprehensive German company. And he said, we produce trucks that was mini machines and not Playmobiles. And he was referring to the PC revolution. And he missed everything. He couldn't see that how the PC was able to change, to be a game changer in the information technology area. Just to mention that. And if you see this this slide here is the forecast is more a simple mechanical predictions. Prognosis are more weight on probability, significance, but foresight, as I already mentioned, looks in addition to circumstances that are in an early phase and that could appear as something highly uncertain and improbable. So if you think things is unlikely, I mean, that could be a good candidate, because to discuss unlikely thing is through that discussion you can be aware of some possible later surprises. That's, and in my I've been carrying out so many different scenario processes, and to allow people to discuss the most crazy things have been absolutely very, very valuable. And I have a friend who's an expert in science fiction and he's writing the history of science fiction. And he said that even some quite far-fetched ideas within science fiction literature is somehow at some point getting more real in the development. I won't elaborate that in concrete, but my point is only that we have to be open towards other areas, transdisciplinary, and also as a financial analyst. I mean, maybe you could even learn from science fiction authors. I mean, you have to be create a kind of openness towards that is possible. So in that sense, that the conventional research is not enough. You have to do other things that you have been doing before. You have to be care more about the uncertainties than you usually do. I won't go in that the kind of scientific theoretical idea that I won't elaborate very much on. But I'm going to talk a bit about this figure. Unfortunately, it's only in Norwegian language, so then you can learn Norwegian language next as a part of my presentation too. No, that's a model about different kind of approaches and methodologies within the foresight tradition. And it's I'm gonna explain it. So above you have creativity. So creativity, that is a Norwegian word for creativity, and then medvirkning is participation, and expertise on that, and evidence. And this is so if you see here, you can have that's. I think you can start out with the maybe most creative methodology you can use if you use it in a good way. That is scenario building. I mean, if you just try to create different scenarios about the possible future based on different outcomes on detected uncertainties, I think that's also very, very interesting exercise to do. And it's also asks demands some of the creativity and mobilize a lot of fantasy. And then you have so-called wildcards. Do you know the difference between the scenarios and the wildcards? Uh, Probably not, but the wildcards is more extreme kind of scenarios, in my opinion. That is highly unlikely, but you still choose to discuss it. And then you have something called early warning, weak signals, and you have backcasting, which is that you put yourself 30 years in the future and you look back to the history from today to that point in the future. In our study, Norway 2030, for 20 years ago, we created a figure in our book. It's called Social Historian 2030. And this guy made a diagnosis in different scenarios about how was that development, how was that scenario possible, what kind of political decisions were made, what kind of trend development, kind of technology uh, was created to make that development possible. So that's a kind of a backcasting. So you put yourself to 20 or 30 years in the future and you look back on the history. And then you have so panels, citizen panels. You have future Werkstatt in German. I don't know the English word for it. Future laboratory.
Yeah,
You can call it.
workshop maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
workshops maybe. Yes, absolutely. And SWOT analysis and horizon scanning and technology assessment, research, different research activities, trend analysis, expert panels, Delphi study. I don't know if you know what the Delphi study is. So Delphi study is, they did a lot in Germany and in Japan and in the States in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. And that was, they invited very high level expertise in different fields. For example, in new converging technology, they invited 2,000 or 3,000 experts, and they created a lot of questionnaires, and they were asked when do you think your research could have a breakthrough, and then they tried to spot the breakthrough, and then they compared it later with other countries and so on and so forth. And you see that in some countries they had some breakthroughs earlier than in other countries. For example, they expected the breakthrough, and then they ask you, when you have this breakthrough, what kind of consequences on social, cultural, and other ways can you imagine as a result of your research and your breakthrough in the research? So that is a very, very interesting exercise also on the expert into your literature studies and the so-called morphological methodology. So I just, want to mention some of the methods used in this field. And later, I mean, I can give you some more references that you can go more deeply into it and try to detect and try to find out what could suit your agenda at the best. Um,
But basically, what you see on the left,
as a follow-up.
sorry,
Yeah,
Erik, to interrupt, just basically on the left-hand side are the more traditional methodologies, I would say. And the other ones are more leaning towards more interaction and creativity.
Yes, exactly. So, the both is a creativity and the expertise, which is a more it's a more conventional way of approaching things. But I think expert-oriented methodology they differ also a lot, due to fantasy development and due to the way they try to figure out the expectations that they have. And evidence is, of course, the more empirical oriented tools that you can have. And this is I've not created this myself. That's there's a European monitoring network within the European Union have started out categorizing foresight methodology along these lines already. So we can go more into that if you have question. So before I stop, I just want to say something about the scenario methodology, because I mean I work in the public as a public servant. I work for a minister, and I can't go to my minister and say, okay, I created 5 scenarios for you, so it's up to you to decide which scenario you should implement. Because but when that is said, the scenario development in advance to a discussion about priorities is also very, very important, because they could bring in more aspect into a more conventional discussion on what kind of priorities should we make, what kind of political decisions should we aim at. So I just want to say a few things about scenario methodology, and I think it's based on mainly 4 questions. What is happening? You have to somehow find the kind of interpret what's going on at the time being. And you have to spot some uncertainty. What kind of dilemmas are we facing? What kind of uncertainties do we orient ourselves towards? Are we experiencing at time being? And then we have to write it down and try to do something about those uncertainties. And you have to ask, of course, why do things happen as it happens? And then maybe the third question, which I think is the most important question in some methodological scene, and it's to ask what may happen. You don't ask what do I think will happen, or what do I believe will happen, or what do I want to happen. You said what may happen, and I think that word may is it's crucial, because then you can end up, and I've seen that several times, to discuss scenarios that you don't like at all, and that's perfect. You should be challenged by your in such processes, and you should be open to discuss also things that you don't like, if that's necessary, or if that's the process point or urge you to do that. And then also what kind of decisions maker to have been contributed to the future development within the single scenario, that you have to be explicit about what kind of possible decision have made this scenario development possible. So I won't go into details on the methodological things here, but that's somehow a kind of there's a lot of literature on how to do these kind of things. But to sum up about the scenarios are holistic pictures, a narrative of possible futures, a tool for learning, instrument for reflecting uncertainties, instrument for strategic thinking, tool for stimulating creativity and fantasy. And what I also like is being wrong in an interesting way. I mean, it's a relevant way. And scenarios are not prognosis, and that's very important to see. It's not visions in that sense, and it's also no goals and strategies. And it's also no final answer to complex question, and it's not about the most probable future, because you develop many scenarios, so all of them can't be similar probable. And a quantitative analysis alone doesn't work. I mean, you have to, very often you create narrative and qualitative perspectives in scenario building. So very, very briefly at the end, I would just want to say something about the educational sector. Just want to skim some of these. I made recently a project about university, future of universities, and we went into, some kind of analysis of what's going to influence the future of learning, and we detected a lot of different factors. Second brain, intelligent learning environment, augmented reality, virtual reality. It's going to influence the learning sector incredible much, and economic aspects, social aspects, adaptive learning, transformational legislation, global learning networks, and MOOCs, and the living classroom, personal ambience for learning, and emergence, and so on and so forth. I won't go in all in the details on that, but we detected a lot of factors that are going to influence that situation, and in particular the learning situation. And I also asked then two central questions. What does it mean to be a professor teacher in 2030, and even later than 2030, because that was, I think, to 2050. What kind of jobs will the working life and society has for specifically dependent on higher education before 2050 or 30? What is emerging? So the question that we try to answer. And then we created some, kind of expectations that we wrote down and that we tried to discuss more thoroughly. And then we, after doing that, we sorted out what could be of interest if we are now going into a discussion of a strategy to find out what do we now want to prioritize and what do we want to do. Because then you can't, then you have to go across the scenarios and try to find out what are we actually in this complexity, and with all those uncertainties, what do we do then? And we had to really find out, because we can't make no decisions either. So that's another thing. Yes. So I just said something, sorry about
perfect in Norwegian after this presentation.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
That was the graphical presentations of 5 different scenarios in the future of educational sector in Norway that I made. And you see here we defined some dimensions. In particular, I won't go so much in detail on that, but one very interesting dimension that we discussed was the relation between the physical aspect of educational situation and the virtual ones. So we wasn't discussing either a physical campus or a digital learning environment, but we discussed a lot of hybrid version of them. So we could see that we have a lot of different possible outcomes or images of future of universities or educational learning situation, and then only according to those 2 dimensions about the physical or the digital ones. So I think that was very valuable for the discussion that we did later. So yeah, so I'm gonna stop there. So
Thank you, Erik. This is really interesting. Also, it allows us a little bit to dive into this, specifically on the topic of education, which is another coincidence that we found, that because the first lab for us is very likely to be on education, and you just happen to have this focus on education in your background. So this is really very, very valuable. Thank you very much for this introduction. And what I take from this introduction is first about the benefits of looking into the future and using these tools by being better prepared for any surprises, and also being able to possibly shape the future at the same time. It's not only being able to react, but possibly if you have already explored a few possible alternative futures, then you can take action today. And this could be of interest to us in our discussion for the Transformative Finance Lab, because we are saying, okay, we're not only looking at what's happening in the past or what the situation is at the moment, but by looking into the future, we can then see what external forces, as you also described them, but also what opportunities arise and what are sort of the opportunity zones in a certain area that we can actually then actively shape as an impact finance network. Where would you say are for you the most benefits of looking at foresight methods or using foresight methods? What is it? What comes out most strongly for you compared to, let's say, other more traditional innovation methods? Or you could compare it a little bit to the research and the trend analysis.
Yeah, so my main achievement, or what I think is the most interesting part of it, is that you kind of systematically allow you to bring in much more fantasy and much more creative ideas into the discussions, and that you actually allow yourself to discuss things that you normally wouldn't discuss. And I think that's the most critical part of it, and that's really what I also seen. I mean, we even did some ex post analysis of a scenario project that we made, and we said that in the beginning of the process we were reluctant to say that the biotechnology, that kind of biotech technology that was too far in the future, so we shouldn't discuss it. And then, just a couple of years afterwards, when we look back, that was realized, far earlier than we expected at the time. And that's the reason why, I mean, you should really allow yourself to bring in so much fantasy that you will. But when that is said, you can't just, you have to organize a thorough process. Otherwise, all those ideas are, just confusing you. So you have to sort out, and you have to be very professional due to the process that you organize.
The tools that you're using, and this is why I really like this wheel that you showed with the different methodologies, where you can see there's a whole range of different methodologies out there, and probably among us we would even find a few more of them. But then really to think about them, what do I want to use them for? Is it about allowing more creativity? Is it about, having more evidence and drawing from the past? I like that there's this tool in future thinking about looking back to look forward, where you actually intentionally look back in order to discover some patterns looking forward. So these are all methodologies that then give a certain structure to this sort of open process, what you describe as allowing
and being a better decision maker, actually.
And being a better decision maker.
Of course. I mean, that's one very important aspect of it. Aline?
I just wanted to ask a question very related to what you said, because to me it makes a lot of sense to explore also the potential of creativity. I know from experience that doesn't relate with everyone, and it resonates with me also what you said. It has to be a carefully curated and facilitated process. So I have two questions. One is like, can you share some best practices of how you facilitate and curate that so that it's actually, leads to the objective that you're trying to achieve? And the second, just what do you do to make that happen? I mean, maybe you can tell us also an example or a story, or maybe you have some best practices to share. And the second question is, how do you deal with people like that are more skeptical, or how do you make people feel in that moment that it's valuable what they did? Because as you said, it kind of materializes far in the future. And in the moment you may think, oh, well, we went a bit beyond, but how do you like,
Yeah.
Sorry, just Erik, just to add on Aline's question, just the perspective of what I find very interesting about your role is that you are both a facilitator as well as a researcher. And really so also to understand a little bit about the power of research in facilitating these discussions, or in what Aline just asked about.
Yeah, well, to the first question, I think, well, to the question about what do you do with the people who are, don't want to engage and are skeptical? Because I think in my experience is that this skepticism also very related to non-competence, in the sense that they don't know what this is about. And in particular in Norway, when I'm most probably one of the people in Norway who have most experience with people who are skeptic towards these kind of approaches, because I've been dealing a lot with economists, with social modeling, social modelings instruments, and so on and so forth, and they are so drilled in their perspective and the way of thinking, so they don't accept and then don't acknowledge other ways of doing this. And I think that's one very big. And on the other side, I mean, it's also much more relevant criticism, in the sense that the tools are not good enough integrated or adapted to the context in which you are doing the foresight exercise, and you don't necessarily are able to think the whole value chain, because I mean, the foresight in itself is not the point. The point is beyond foresight, in the sense that you actually are doing better decisions, and you are behaving, you're acting in a better way. Like what you say, Anja, in the beginning, that here that you can think along the term of the Greek triangle, that you are reflecting on the future, that you're discussing in the future, and you are trying to change the future. I think the change aspect is very, very important to think. So to me, foresight is only part of a bigger value chain of exercise, and you have to design the foresight according to what do you want to have the outcome of the whole process.
Yes, Gianluca, you were first, I think, or was it Annika? I think it was Gianluca.
I don't wanna actually lose time to Annika. Sorry for raising the hand before her, but very quickly on Erik, on the very quick question. So thank you very much for the presentation. But question is, when you open up to unlikely scenarios, then you open up basically to every scenario possible, because what's unlikely can be really a lot of things. So how do you navigate that universe and select those unlikely scenarios that can actually be like the less unlikely of among the unlikeliest? Because yeah, how do you make sure that it's not a waste of time and it has some learnings? Are there some tools to navigate this universe?
So my experience is that the biggest problem is to open up and to bring more fantasy into the process than that you bring too much fantasy in the process. Of course, I mean, if every scenario project would end up with discussing some aliens are conquering the earth or something like that, I mean, that's of non-interest. So you had to create some criteria to say what is of interest to us to discuss, but that on the basic of a foresight methodological approach and not a forecast orientation or prediction logic. And I think that's very important to see. And it's also, you have to select, because as a scenario expert or a scenario facilitator, you are free. I mean, you play a kind of a god here, so you can do whatever you want. And so we have to find a balance between what is far-fetched and what is interesting and what is too conventional. So you have to decide, and you have to do that in a certain context, because there's no way to define that in advance.
Thank you.
Annika.
Thank you. This is so interesting, the discussion. I think we could go on for hours here, but I wanted to go back briefly on the more skeptical participants in these kind of workshops and rounds. Could you explain a little bit on how robust these methods are? Because you mentioned the positive example on, well, then the biotechnology came sooner than you had expected it, but would you also recall a scenario which then did not turn out, or where the contrary then actually evolved and not the one that you were discussing, so that you were contradicted in a way, even though you went through the process?
Yeah, first, I think we have to recognize that scenario when we are creating scenarios, most of the ideas and most of the expectation horizons that we create then is not going to happen. I mean, because that's the logic of it, because we are discussing what may happen, not what's actually we think gonna happen. So the scenario methodology pointing at a lot of interesting possible developments, but you know, because you are creating for example, five different scenarios, all those five scenarios cannot happen in the end, but there are ideas in between or within those different scenarios that could, you know, when you are starting discussing them, you could be much more conscious about, oh my goodness, I haven't thought about that. That's something interesting. That might actually happen. So I had to change my approach towards those ideas, that I can't leave them out anymore. I have to bring them into my more decision-oriented discussions, and so on and so forth. So, and I mean, that could be anything. That could be anything. So that's the art of the scenario process. That's a kind of artistic way of behaving.
And I guess it comes back to the what you said earlier. It's the purpose of the whole process that makes the difference. If the purpose is to predict the future, then your process will be different compared to if you're running such a scenario analysis, which is more about, you know, building your own capacity to or maybe your awareness. What you're saying reminds me a little bit of an increased awareness. Is that
awareness is right? Yeah.
Yeah, and making certain assumptions maybe also visible in the group, but also raising awareness about different things that may happen, and in that sense they create their own reality that comes then emerges in the group. Yeah, interesting.
Exactly.
Yes, unfortunately, we are close to ending the session, and as Annika said earlier, we could probably go on for a long time. Are there any other burning questions that we should still discuss with Erik? Otherwise, I would just
Many.
many. I can see this. Yes, if you may,
yeah.
we can hopefully come back to you with some more specific question, or maybe also some brainstorming, if you have time, would you be able to share the presentation with us? Then we can also put it on.
I can share it if you yeah, so even with the Norwegian slides, you know.
Yeah, for example, the future of education, that would be quite interesting.
Yeah, okay.
That's
So yeah, but a couple of the slides there's a copyright on it because it's not from me. So
yeah, no, that's for sure. We won't share them anywhere.
I can send you the presentations on by email, and
Perfect. Thank you so much. So what just to close the session, what would be the advice you would give to us now designing the Transformative Finance Lab from a perspective of a futurist?
I think I want to make a kind of research on what kind of methodologies could be most appropriate to what we are aiming at. I think because it's a lot of long range of possibilities there, and you really have to adapt it to your own context, and you really have to critically review these methodologies to be able to make it as positive as possible for your efforts. I think that I would start off with that, and then also, of course, be very, very conscious and aware about the shift in logic behind how you approach things, because that's something, to me, one of my experiences that people are mixing up things. You know, they don't know if they are discussing what should we decide on, and even if they are involved in scenario projects, so they start, oh, that's not likely, I mean, that's bullshit, I mean, that I don't believe in that, and so on and so forth. And then I mean, you need that openness, and you need to create an arena and a platform with that kind of openness. And then you need some methodological approaches to allow that.
So one is about the tools, the other one is about the facilitation to allow these different perspectives to emerge, and it's probably a combination of both. One is
that's how I see it.
Thank you so much, Erik. It was wonderful to have you here, and I hope we can keep in touch on the topic of future thinking in transformative finance. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody else who attended.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.